everybody. Lovely to see you. Well, I can't see you, but it's lovely to feel that you're there. I'm going to give you a little explanation of the title first of my book, I'm Black, So You Don't Have to Be. So I was born in 1961 of Jamaican parents. That same year, my uncle, Castus, came to the UK from Jamaica. And in my uncle's estimation, as we grew up, we were not like nephew and uncle, we were more like brothers. But in his mind, he was smarter than me, he was better looking than me, he was more charming than me, he was more erudite, but he hadn't had the breaks in life that I've had. And time again, he would say he'd arrived here too soon. He'd arrived so much so that he was just considered another irksome darky. And whenever we spoke about this, he would say to me, I'm black, Colin, so you don't have to be. And he is a character who populates the book. He's throughout every chapter, more or less. And this first image here is a collage, which has been designed by my daughter, the artist, Jazz Grant. And I love this collage because it signals my time with her. She's a little girl. I'm holding her hand. We're in Jamaica there, but you can see a great picture of Luton, where I'm from, in the background. And you can see the blue Caribbean Sea. Now, the book is, in essence, a family story, and it really begins with my mother, who is in the next photograph. My mother, Ethlyn, recognized that when I was 10, that I had good brains, and she was feeding me all the fish that she could get hold of, but it wasn't going to make any difference because I was destined for the failing state school. So she determined that I should go to a private school in order to further my chances in life. At that time, I was one of 5 children, and she was married to this man called Bageye, and Bageye worked at Vauxhall Motors on the production line. He was a man of great charm, but he was a man that my mother shouldn't have married. But anyway, she convinced him that they would have to do something to get this boy to a private school because the failing state school wasn't going to be good enough. So he recognized that he would have difficulty earning enough money, not only to keep us all alive and in clothing and with a roof over our head, but to send me to this private school. So at this point, I always say that my education was funded by marijuana. So my father came to Britain from Jamaica with his love of ganja intact, and he recognized that all of his Caribbean friends also came with their love of ganja intact. So I was a little bag man. We'd pass up these little packets of marijuana, and we'd drive around Luton, dropping off the marijuana. And it meant that I eventually got to go to this rather expensive private school, St. Columba's College in St. Albans. I was always impressed, though, by the way that my father dealt with the police, because often when we were stopped, and we stopped quite a lot, there were things in the car that ought not to be there, not just the marijuana, but knockoff booze from the local RAF base, Lakenheath. We'd be stopped by the equivalent of PC blogs, and my father would promote him immediately. So he became Detective Inspector, sir, Chief Constable, sir. And he would be so amused that he'd wave us on. Though I must tell you now, that's him at his car. It wasn't his car, actually, it's my uncle's car. That's a Ford Cortina Mark II. That's a yellow car with a chocolate top. But eventually, spoiler, crime doesn't pay, even though I don't think he thought he was committing a crime. He was providing a service for his Caribbean friends. He got caught, the police came, they raided the house, they dug up the front garden, they dug up the back garden, they rifled through all the drawers, cupboards, wardrobes, and eventually they found a huge stash of marijuana. I was always impressed, though, by the fact that my father went to court, but the judge never sent him to jail. It meant, though, that my mother was rather annoyed and disappointed and embarrassed and shamed by what had happened. So eventually she showed him the door, and I didn't see him from the age of 12 or 13 or so. Miraculously, I was still able to go to this expensive private school. Every few months, though, at the end of the term, I'd get a letter. I'd have to carry a letter home from the bursar, a letter to my mother reminding her that she was late again with the rent. not with the rent, with the fees, school fees. My mother, it was a Catholic school, my mother would write back immediately saying to the bursar, well, what would Jesus do? So she shamed them into giving me a private school education, rather expensive education. I mean, I was an altar boy as well, and I became the head boy at that school. But all along, I was geared towards going to medical school. When I was 10, my father sat me down on the edge of his bed and just instructed me that I was going to become a doctor. That was the plan. So everything I did was geared towards that end. Eventually, I did get to medical school, and you'll see some of my chums in the next photograph at the London Hospital in Whitechapel. This is in the early 1980s, and London was a place we knew very little about. I came from a small town called Luton, about 20 miles north of London. And there I am with my dragon brooch. We look like a team of snooker players there, but these are all my medical student friends. And the first thing that we did was to find accommodation. Whitechapel, though, was an area I knew very little about, other than it was a bad square to land on when you played Monopoly. And when we arrived in Whitechapel, the Monopoly board didn't seem to be wrong. It was a sort of burnt out rubble was everywhere. There was corrugated iron, there was barbed wire. If you brushed too heavily alongside the walls of a house, the walls would wobble. And it was a rather peculiar place to be because we were schooled in pathology. So the first thing you do at medical school is to dissect a cadaver. Your first patient is a dead patient. You spend a year dissecting a cadaver. You spend a year learning pathologies. And we were taught to think pathology all the time. Think pathology, think pathology. You're walking down Whitechapel High Street. You see a man who's bent over. He has a mirror in his hand. Half his nose is missing. What's that? Oh, that's tertiary syphilis. You're walking down Brick Lane. A Bengali woman hops into the pavement. There's blood in her sputum. What's that? Oh, that's tuberculosis. So we thought of people as just walking pathology, or the potential to be walking pathology. And it took a while to change your outlook from thinking of people as pathologists, people who are worthy of pathos. In that very first year, also, a pathologist gave us a lecture where he talked about the fact that in Britain, the percentage of the people who have schizophrenia is 1%. 1% of the population has schizophrenia. Amongst young Black boys and girls, though, the percentage of schizophrenia is 6%. There's 6 times more incidence of schizophrenia than they ought to be. And the pathologist turned to me in this big lecture hall and asked me directly why I thought this would be the case. And I was too embarrassed and didn't really know what the answer might be anyway. Eventually, he said very coldly, that's because Black people are schooled in paranoia. And to a degree, he wasn't wrong, because when I was growing up in Luton, in this Jamaican migrant household, my father had a mantra which he rolled out to us all the time. And the mantra was that you're being watched. You're being watched to see which way you turn. You're being watched to see whether the host country believes you to be destined for a life of criminality, to be feckless, work shy, etc. So confound their expectations, show your best face to the world. He encourages to have a kind of bella figura. And also what he was saying was, don't let people know what you really think. Mask yourself so that you can't be targeted. And it's akin to another strategy that's used by Jamaicans, actually. It's called play fool to catch wise, which is a strategy employed by the enslaved people in the time of slavery in the Caribbean. If you feared the master's wrath or the driver's whip, it was best to play fool, to become, or to project yourself as more of an idiot, more of a simpleton than you actually were, in order to disabuse people of the notion that you constituted a threat. And that was a strategy that we employed, and I think a lot of Caribbean people, a lot of Black people employed when I was growing up. And it meant that when I left medical school, because medical school wasn't a very good fit for me, actually, I stuck it out for 5 long years, but eventually I left and managed to persuade the BBC to give me a job. I joined the BBC in the early 1990s, and this next photograph is a photograph of me outside of Bush House, which is the headquarters, or was the headquarters of the BBC World Service. And it was a great place to be because it introduced you to a kind of United Nations of people. And you recognize that you are bigger as a unit than the kind of parochial mindset of some of the more domestic services. And I played fool to catch wise in the BBC. I dialed down my color. That's another thing that you might hear, dialing down your color. And that's to, again, to enable people to see you and not see your color. So you dial down your color, you might even start whistling, I don't know, whistling Beethoven, or quote from Schopenhauer, or try to give people the idea that you have the same cultural reference points as they, and that you are, but for the color of your skin, you're just like them. And I dialed down my color quite unashamedly, I think, for the first few years in the BBC. I was in the BBC for more than 20 years. And it was rather lovely. The only time you got into trouble really is when you came outside of the BBC. I had a job at one point where I was tasked with writing what the papers say for the next morning's edition. So you get the editions at 10 p.m. The shift started at 10 p.m. or 9 p.m. and you would finish by 4 p.m. I had a flat in Wapping, and Bush House was based on the Strand. And it meant that you could actually drive into London, it's very quiet at 10 p.m. and park outside of Bush House, and then get into your car at the end of your shift, drive down to the embankment, do a left, get to Wapping. I had a nice Capri, actually, not a Cortina, but a Capri. I had a peppermint green Capri with a chocolate top. But each time I drove, once a month, I'd be stopped by the police. It got so bad that I would go the other way. I would go up to Holborn, over to Clerkenwell, Shoreditch, and then down to Wapping. It added another 10 minutes on the drive, but it saved the hassle. Until one night, I thought to myself, I'm just going to go the quickest way home. I'm just going to risk it. So I got into my car, I drove down to the embankment, bang, stopped by the police. And the two policemen, one black, one white, they always give the bad stuff to the black policeman to do. And I remember asking him in a very shirty way, what's the problem here, officer? And he said, well, there are cobwebs on your bumper. And I remember thinking, cobwebs on my bumper. I started to repeat this phrase again and again and again. I was getting a bit more irate, and suddenly I heard a voice in my head. It said, what would Bageye say? And I said, well, Detective Inspector. And the police constable said, who are you calling Detective Inspector, mate? And I said, who are you calling mate, mate? And what I hadn't recognized that my father was a humble working class Jamaican, who sounded such. I sounded like a middle class twat who was patronizing this policeman. So sometimes you can't learn the lessons to good effect that your parents might impart. But I want to tell you about what really happened to me finally. I reached the point in my life at the BBC where I forgot that I was supposed to dial down my color. I was supposed to play fool to catch wise. And there came a time in the BBC where the BBC parachuted into various departments managers who had no experience of the people that they were managing. And on one occasion, a manager came in, and we were all working in very discreet offices, 4 people to an office, rather civilized setting. And she came in and decided that she would knock down all the walls and make everything open plan. And she called for a meeting of all the producers. I was the radio producer, and she came in with the plans, and she went round the table of 15 producers and asked them all their opinion about these plans. And it being the BBC, people are very timid, actually, and they just mumbled. Most of the people just mumbled something incomprehensible until it came to me. And I said, oh, I don't like open plan. It reminds me of the slave plantation with the slave master in the big house looking over the enslaved people. And most people laughed, but a few days later, or a week later, I got an invitation to a disciplinary hearing where I was accused of being aggressive. And I was rather shocked and alarmed and disappointed by that, because my parents had scrimped and saved and sent me to a private school. I've been an altar boy for 7 years. I've been a head boy at junior school, head boy at senior school, at medical school. I was establishment material, but that counted for nothing. So eventually I was investigated for about 6 months, and they interviewed everybody that I'd ever worked with. And one of the peculiar things that happens is that you turn into a character from a Kafka novel, like a character in The Trial, or from a George Orwell novel. And the interrogator, the independent interrogator, started off by asking me to describe 3 words that would characterize me. And I'd say, well, I'm not playing this game. But eventually I said, okay, I'm tall and I'm black. And she said, and aggressive? And I said, no, I'm not going to answer to that word. That's a word that's been used to describe people like me over the decades, over the centuries. After 6 long months, after 6 months of sleeplessness, I was summoned back to the BBC, and my interrogator held out the sheet of paper and read out verdict.